What happens when a 9-year-old girl becomes the voice of justice? Threatened by a racist police force and kidnapped by those in power, she fights back, revealing a corrupt system that's been hiding in the shadows. Watch as the battle for truth unfolds and discover the shocking confession that changes everything. Will the system finally be held accountable, or will the truth be buried forever? Keep watching. You won't believe what happens next. Where are you watching from? Are you ready to witness the fight for justice? Maya stood tall in the midst of the park, her small frame barely visible over the crowd, but her sign was clear: End racial injustice. Her heart raced as she gripped the cardboard tightly, the weight of what she was doing pressing down on her chest. It wasn't just a sign, it was a declaration of everything she believed in. She could feel the buzz in the air, the gathering crowd murmuring around her, but she stood firm as her mother, Linda, moved through the group, speaking to some of the protesters about the importance of their cause. Maya had never been part of something like this before. She was just a 9-year-old girl, but the injustice she had seen, the injustice her family had fought against for so long, had finally reached her, igniting something inside her. A sudden sharp voice broke through her thoughts. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" Officer Derek Green's tone was harsh as he approached Maya, his presence alone enough to send a shiver down her spine. His partner, Officer Linda Carver, followed behind, her expression unreadable. Maya's grip tightened on her sign, but she didn't flinch. She knew what was coming. "I'm here to stand for what's right," Maya answered, her voice steady, though her pulse quickened. She didn't back down. Not now. Not when she knew so many people had fought for this right. Green scoffed, stepping closer to her, towering over the young girl. "You're just a kid. You don't understand what you're protesting for." His eyes were cold, dismissive, and Maya could feel the sting of his words. "I understand more than you think," Maya replied. The words were out before she could second-guess them. "I'll be addressing the United Nations next month on racial justice." For a moment, the officer's eyes flickered with surprise, but then a cruel smile spread across his face. He stepped even closer, his shadow engulfing Maya. "The United Nations? You think a little girl like you is going to speak there? You're just being used by others." Maya's heart pounded in her chest, but she held her ground. She had practiced this moment in her head 1,000 times. What she would say, how she would stand, how she would make sure her voice was heard. This wasn't just a protest. This was her life, her story. "Don't mock me," she said, her voice calm yet firm. "I'm not being used. I'm speaking the truth." Green's eyes narrowed as he took a step closer, his voice rising. "You don't get to stand here and preach about things you don't understand. You're a child. This is grown-up business." His tone was dismissive, and it cut through the air like a knife. Maya's mind raced. She knew she had to keep her composure. The weight of everything she'd ever learned, everything her mother had taught her, pressed down on her shoulders. This wasn't just about one girl holding a sign. This was about standing up to something much bigger, something much darker. She wouldn't back down. "Maya, it's okay," Linda's voice interrupted, a calming presence behind her. Maya didn't turn, but she could feel her mother's strength. Linda stepped forward, her voice now steady but strong, addressing Officer Green. "This is a peaceful protest. She has every right to be here." Green looked past Maya and at Linda, his gaze shifting from judgment to something darker. "We'll see about that," he muttered, his voice laced with thinly veiled threat. Officer Carver, who had been quiet this whole time, shifted uneasily, her eyes darting between Green and Linda. The discomfort was palpable, but she didn't speak. She didn't know what to say. She'd been silent for so long. Could she really be a part of this system anymore? "I'm just trying to protect my daughter," Linda said, her voice still calm but filled with authority. "And the law says she has every right to stand here," Green sneered. "We'll see if that's the case when we check the footage." He signaled to Carver, who reluctantly pulled out her camera. The officers circled Maya, the tension escalating. Maya's pulse throbbed in her temples, but she held her ground. For a brief moment, Maya's mind drifted back to the classroom where she'd written her speech for the United Nations. She had written about things like this, about how power had been used to oppress her, to silence her. And now, in this very moment, she was living it. The truth she had written would stand. She would not let fear take over her. "Mom?" Maya's voice was soft but firm. "We're not afraid," Linda smiled gently, her hand resting on Maya's shoulder. "No, we're not." As the officers continued to assess the situation, Linda's eyes met Carver's. There was a silent exchange between them. Linda could see the unease in Carver's eyes, but Carver remained silent, unable to speak out against the system that had taken her in. The weight of the moment hung in the air. Officer Green stepped back, exhaling sharply. "Let's see what the cameras have to say about this." His words were final, but the uncertainty behind his voice wasn't lost on Maya or Linda. The tension lingered in the air, thick and charged. Maya's stance remained unwavering. As the crowd around them watched, the world seemed to pause for a moment. This wasn't just a protest. This was the beginning of something much bigger. Maya knew that today was a turning point, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been silenced by injustice. Maya's eyes never left Officer Green. She could feel his gaze, heavy and judgmental, but she refused to look away. Her sign, End Racial Injustice, remained in her hands, a silent symbol of everything that she believed in. The crowd around her had begun to stir, whispering, murmuring under their breath. Some were angered, others confused, but most just stood still, watching. Officer Green's threat hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. But Maya held her ground. "You don't have the right to silence me," she thought. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to flinch. This was her moment. She wasn't going to let them take it away. Then, just as the tension between Maya and the officers seemed to reach its breaking point, Sarah Thompson's voice broke through. "Everything okay here?" Maya turned her head just slightly, only for a moment, and saw Sarah standing at the edge of the crowd, her phone raised, capturing every moment of the confrontation. Sarah, a local activist who had been attending protests and documenting injustices for years, was always around when things got heated, always with a camera in hand. But Maya didn't know if this was a moment she could welcome. "I said, is everything okay?" Sarah asked again, her voice calm but assertive. Officer Green, already frustrated, turned towards Sarah. "Mind your business." But Sarah didn't flinch. "This is my business. People have a right to know what's happening here," she said, the camera now trained on the officer. The words had power. Sarah's calm was a stark contrast to Green's escalating anger. Her presence was a quiet rebellion, one that Maya hadn't anticipated but needed more than ever. The crowd around them began to shift. Some took out their phones, others stood in solidarity, recording what was happening. Maya could feel it, the shift from fear to power. The moment was no longer just between her and the officers. It was being witnessed. It was becoming something bigger. Maya took a deep breath. She could feel the heat of Green's stare. But the feeling of the crowd gathering, the collective strength of the onlookers, was something she had never felt before. Her nerves, which had been fraying at the edges, began to steady. She was not alone anymore. "This is wrong," Maya said, finally breaking the silence that had gripped the park. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. "I have every right to be here, just like everyone else." Green's face twisted in anger. He stepped toward her, and the crowd fell silent. "I don't care what you think, girl. This isn't the place for you." He said the words slowly, his eyes cold, aiming to strip her of her dignity. But Maya wasn't going to let him. "I'm not just a girl. I'm a voice for justice," she said. The words came out before she could stop them. She didn't know where the courage was coming from, but it was there, burning bright and strong in her chest. "And you'll see that when I speak at the United Nations next month." A moment of stunned silence followed her words. Green blinked, caught off guard. He didn't know how to respond to the certainty in her voice. "The United Nations? You're not—" "Yes, I am," Maya interrupted, her voice stronger than before. "And I'll be heard. You can't stop that." There was a moment where the two just stared at each other, a challenge hanging between them. Then Green's face darkened, his jaw tightening. He glanced at Carver, who was standing silently behind him. Carver's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but she didn't speak. Maya noticed the hesitation in her stance, a small but telling sign of doubt. And that was when it happened, something unexpected. A small woman in the back of the crowd stepped forward, her face familiar to Maya. It was Linda, her mother, but something about her presence was different now. Linda had always been a pillar of strength for Maya, but today, standing beside her, Linda felt like a warrior. "Enough!" Linda's voice rang out, calm but firm, as she stepped into the circle of tension between Maya and the officers. Her eyes locked with Green's, and there was no mistaking the authority in her gaze. Green's expression faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "I said step aside," he growled, trying to assert his dominance. "She's a child, and this is a place for adults." Linda didn't move an inch. She squared her shoulders, standing tall beside Maya. My daughter has every right to be here, officer, and I have every right to stand by her. You may not like it, but you will respect it. For a moment, the air was thick with tension. Green's gaze flickered between Linda and Maya. The crowd held its breath, waiting for what would come next. Then, with a grunt of frustration, Green stepped back, not wanting to escalate further with the gathered witnesses. Fine, Green muttered, but his eyes were still cold. We'll be watching. He turned sharply and began walking away, signaling to Carver, who hesitated before following him. The crowd let out a collective sigh, but the tension was still heavy in the air. Linda turned to Maya, her face softening with a quiet pride. You did well, Maya, she said, her voice filled with warmth. We'll make sure your voice is heard. Maya smiled, but her heart was still racing. This was only the beginning, she knew. This moment was just a small piece of much larger fight, but it had been hers. It was a step towards something bigger, and she would continue to take those steps no matter what. As the officers disappeared into the distance, Sarah lowered her camera, a knowing smile on her face. You're not alone in this fight, Maya, she said. Maya looked around the park, seeing faces of support in the crowd. This wasn't just her fight anymore. This was something bigger. The real battle was just beginning. The next few days felt like an unrelenting storm. Maya and Linda couldn't step outside without being bombarded by media calls, protests, and the incessant noise of their newfound visibility. The video of Maya and the officers had gone viral, but it wasn't just spreading across social media. It was making waves in the city, in the state, and soon, across the nation. Maya was now a symbol of resistance, her face plastered across news outlets, but with that visibility came the backlash. Online trolls filled her inbox with hate messages. Threats were left on Linda's phone. It felt like their lives had been turned upside down, each day more dangerous than the last. And amidst the chaos, Linda couldn't shake the unease in her chest. Something about Officer Green, the anger in his eyes, didn't sit right with her. Late one evening, as Linda sat in her home office, her eyes scanned through files, reports, and articles she had gathered. A disturbing thought kept creeping into her mind. What if the encounter with Green wasn't as random as it seemed? She had learned to trust her gut in the courtroom, and her gut told her there was something more at play here, something much bigger than just a rogue cop. She picked up the phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. It was a number she knew would lead her to answers. Agent Blackwell, it's Linda Bennett, she said when the call connected. Linda, came the gruff voice on the other end. It's been a long time. What can I do for you? I need help with something. I have a feeling that Officer Green is connected to something bigger, something dangerous. There's something off about this whole situation, and I think it's more than just one officer. Blackwell was silent for a moment, the weight of her words settling between them. I'll look into it. I'll get back to you soon. After hanging up, Linda leaned back in her chair, exhausted. The truth was getting closer. She could feel it, creeping at the edges of everything she had worked for, everything she believed in. But there was something holding her back, an undeniable fear that she might be stepping into something much darker than she had prepared for. The next day, the phone rang again. This time, it was Blackwell. You were right. Green isn't just a bad cop. He's connected to some powerful people. His ties go all the way to the top, politicians, law enforcement officials, even criminal organizations. Linda's heart skipped a beat. Who are we talking about here? There's a network, a group that's been running operations for years. They have connections in the highest places, and they've been using the police force to protect their interests. Green's not just a pawn, he's part of it. Linda stood up, her mind racing. She had seen corruption before, but never like this. What are we talking about? Drugs? Money laundering? Not just that, Blackwell replied. They've been controlling election results, manipulating investigations, and silencing anyone who gets too close. And now, with the spotlight on Green, it's all beginning to unravel. A chill ran down Linda's spine. This was bigger than she had imagined, and if Green was part of it, if he was that deeply entrenched, it meant that their fight for justice was about to face forces far more dangerous than she had anticipated. Linda couldn't sit still anymore. She needed answers, and she needed them fast. She called Maya into the living room, where her daughter sat, quietly scrolling through her phone. The last few days had taken their toll on both of them, but Maya had a fire in her eyes, a determination that wasn't easily shaken. Maya, we're in deeper than we thought. The police officer who threatened you, he's part of something huge. It's not just him. There's a whole network, a group of powerful people pulling the strings. Maya looked up at her mother, her brow furrowed. What do you mean, network? Linda sat down beside her. I mean, there are people in high places, politicians, law enforcement officials, criminals. They've been using the system to keep everything under control, and now that you've spoken out, they're going to come after us. Maya nodded, her eyes hardening. But we're not backing down, right? Linda smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from Maya's face. No, we're not backing down. That night, Linda couldn't sleep. Her mind was spinning with the information Blackwell had given her. She stared at the ceiling, wondering how far the corruption went. How deep did it run? And how many people, how many innocent people, had been swept under the rug for the sake of power? The next day, Linda received a text from Sarah Thompson. The message was brief, but it sent a chill through her spine. I know someone who can help. They want to meet. It was the last thing Linda expected. She wasn't sure who Sarah knew or what this person could offer, but desperation had begun to creep into Linda's mind. She had no choice. She had to take the meeting. Later that afternoon, they met at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, a place that seemed so normal, yet Linda felt every nerve in her body on high alert. Sarah was already seated at a corner table, her phone hidden beneath her jacket. Linda, you came, Sarah said, glancing around before lowering her voice. This is serious. You need to trust me. Linda sat down, her eyes scanning the room. What's this about? Sarah leaned forward. The people you're up against are more dangerous than you realize. The people Green is connected to. They've got eyes everywhere, but I know someone who has the connections to take them down. Linda's heart raced. Who? Sarah hesitated for a moment before speaking. Someone in the force, someone who's been watching Green. They can help, but it's going to take time. You'll have to stay quiet, at least for now. Linda's instincts screamed at her to be careful, but she had come this far, and she wasn't about to stop now. We'll do it, Linda said, her voice firm. But I want this to end, for good. The phone rang early the next morning, shattering the silence that had descended over the house. Linda's hand hovered over the receiver, her instincts already telling her this call would not bring good news. She picked it up, trying to steady her breath as her pulse quickened. Miss Bennett, we've got a situation, came the voice of one of her contacts in the media. You're going to want to see this. She immediately sat up, her heart sinking into her stomach. A pit formed as the voice on the other end continued. There's a new story circulating. It's about Maya. Someone's already questioning her legitimacy. A few anonymous sources are claiming she's part of a radical agenda, that she's being used by outside groups. Linda's fingers tightened around the phone, the weight of what was happening crashing down on her. The media, the political figure from the other night, they were beginning to mobilize. No, Linda muttered under her breath, her heart racing. This can't be happening. But it was. The backlash had already begun. Maya's small act of defiance, her presence at the protest, was now being twisted into something far more dangerous. The smear campaign was swift, and it had found its target. Linda's voice tightened with resolve. We've been prepared for this. Keep me posted, and let's see who's behind this. She hung up, the phone still buzzing in her hand. The world outside her windows felt like it was closing in. The same people who had tried to silence Maya in the park were now using every tool at their disposal to discredit her, and by extension, Linda. Within hours, the first wave of online attacks began flooding in. Social media platforms exploded with threats and allegations. Maya was labeled a puppet of radical forces, her voice twisted into something unrecognizable. The word stung, but what hurt the most was the effect it had on Maya. Linda found her daughter sitting in the kitchen, staring blankly at the screen of her phone. Maya's usual confidence was gone, replaced with an uncertain, almost haunted look. Mom, they're saying I'm just a pawn, that I don't even know what I'm doing. Maya's voice trembled as she spoke. They're saying I don't belong at the United Nations, that I'm too young, too naive. They're saying I'm not real. Linda knelt down beside her, her heart breaking as she took Maya's hands in hers. Listen to me, Maya, she said, her voice unwavering. You are real. Your voice is powerful, and you have the right to speak. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. They're scared of you. That's why they're attacking you. Maya's eyes welled up, but she refused to let the tears fall. I don't want to be scared anymore, Mom. I just want to do the right thing. You are doing the right thing, Linda reassured her, pulling her daughter into an embrace. But we have to be strong, and together, we'll fight back. Maya nodded silently, though Linda could see the fear still lingering in her eyes. Linda knew her daughter wasn't used to this, used to being attacked by people who didn't even know her. She was used to being the light in their fight, not the target. Linda felt the full weight of their situation pressing down on her, not just the media storm, but the very real danger that now loomed over their heads. The smear campaign was only the beginning. She could feel the walls closing in, the silent threats getting louder, and if they were going to make it through this, they had to be smarter, more strategic. Linda knew that if they stayed on the defensive, they'd be swallowed whole. She needed to take control. They had already been playing the game on their terms, but now it was time to turn the tables. "Get me everything we have on Green," Linda said to her assistant, her voice steady despite the chaos. "I need to know everything about him, every connection, every relationship, every move he's made." The assistant's voice crackled through the line, surprised at the urgency. "You think this goes deeper than just him, don't you?" Linda didn't answer immediately, her thoughts racing. "Yes, I think this goes much deeper." The hours dragged on as Linda and her team worked tirelessly to compile the information on Officer Green and his ties to the corrupt network Blackwell had warned her about. The pressure was mounting. Every phone call, every text, every threat hanging over them felt like a countdown, each moment bringing them closer to an inevitable clash. By evening, Linda was feeling the weight of their situation more than ever. It wasn't just her fight anymore, it was Maya's. And now it was the entire community's fight. Linda had been a lawyer for most of her life, but this was different. This was a fight for their survival, for the truth to be heard, and for the justice that had so long been denied. The next day, the story had escalated even further. An anonymous leak had surfaced, and a reporter from a local news station arrived at Linda's office, demanding an interview. The leak had been designed to destroy Maya's credibility, to paint her as a puppet in the hands of radical forces. It was a calculated attack, and it left Linda with no choice. She met the reporter with a calm but steely composure. "You want to know the truth?" Linda began, her voice sharp with authority. "The truth is that my daughter is fighting for justice. She's fighting for the people who have been silenced, the people who have been ignored, the people who have had their rights stripped away, and you're trying to take that away from her because you're afraid of what we're doing." The reporter hesitated, caught off guard by Linda's sudden shift in tone, but she didn't back down. "This isn't about radicalism, this is about truth. This is about justice. And you can try to tear her down all you want, but we're not going anywhere." She stood up, her words final. "You tell your sources that, and let them know that this fight is just beginning." Linda's heart was pounding, but the resolve she felt in that moment was undeniable. The game had changed. She wasn't just defending Maya anymore. She was making her stand. And with that, the final phase of their fight had begun. The weight of everything that had happened was starting to sink in. Linda sat at her desk, her fingers typing furiously as she pored over files, court documents, and old police reports. She had always been able to find the truth, if she knew where to look. But this was different. The truth she was searching for wasn't just buried in paperwork. It was hidden in the shadows, guarded by a system that had protected its own for far too long. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. Sarah Thompson's name lit up in bold letters. Linda's heart skipped. After everything that had happened in the last few days, Sarah had become more than just a friend. She was an ally, someone Linda could trust. "Linda, I've got something." Sarah's voice came through the phone, urgent but cautious. "You're not going to believe it, but I found some files that point directly to Green. He's connected to a lot more than you think." Linda leaned forward, her fingers gripping the phone tightly. "What do you mean?" "I've been digging, and I found some internal police documents, things that tie Green to the illegal activities that have been going on under the radar. I'm talking about money laundering, bribery, even election tampering, and he's not alone in this. He's working with someone on the inside, someone high up." Linda's stomach clenched. This was exactly what she had feared. It was one thing to suspect corruption. It was another to know that Green was at the heart of it all. "You're sure?" Linda's voice was steady, but there was a tremor beneath the surface. "Where did you get these files?" "I can't go into details right now, but I have copies. Meet me, I'll explain everything," Sarah said, her voice low and full of urgency. Linda knew she didn't have time to waste. She needed those files, needed the evidence to expose Green and everyone involved. Half an hour later, Linda met Sarah in the dimly lit corner of a quiet coffee shop, the kind of place where nobody asked questions. Sarah handed Linda a small, unmarked envelope. Linda opened it carefully, feeling the weight of what it contained. Inside were a series of documents, official-looking police memos, some with redacted sections. But it was what wasn't redacted that caught Linda's attention. Names, dates, transactions, and most damning of all, a list of officers involved. I knew it was bad, but I didn't expect it to be this bad, Linda muttered, scanning the pages. Green's been involved in so much. This isn't just a few bad decisions. This is an entire system built on corruption. Sarah nodded grimly. And it goes deeper than Green. The files point to connections with local politicians, influential figures in the city, and even national players. This is bigger than Jacksonville. This is nationwide. Linda felt the blood drain from her face as she absorbed the implications. This wasn't just a case of a few rogue cops. It was a network, a deeply entrenched system of corruption that had been allowed to thrive under the radar. But now that it was exposed, the stakes were higher than ever. Who else is involved? Linda asked, her voice a mix of anger and disbelief. Sarah pointed to one of the documents. This name, Councilman Roger Collins. He's the one pulling Green's strings. Collins has been pushing for policies that protect the officers and help launder money for the underground network. Linda's mind raced. Collins, she'd heard of him before. A powerful local figure with a reputation for pushing through legislation that benefited the rich and powerful. But now, his connections were undeniable. He was part of the very system they were trying to dismantle. Where do we go from here? Linda asked, feeling a mix of determination and dread. They had the evidence now, but it wasn't enough to just expose it. They had to act fast. Sarah hesitated, her eyes scanning the room as though checking for anyone who might be listening. I've been in contact with some people. They're ready to help, but we have to be careful. If they get wind of this, things could get even worse. This isn't just about taking down Green. This is about taking down an entire system. Linda nodded. We don't have a choice. We're in this now, and I'm not backing down. As Linda left the coffee shop, the weight of the situation settled heavily on her shoulders. The path ahead was dangerous, she knew that, but the truth had been exposed. Now they had to bring it to light. The people behind the corruption couldn't be allowed to get away with it any longer. At home, Maya was waiting. She had been quieter than usual, withdrawn. Linda had seen the toll the past few days had taken on her daughter. Maya was still a child, still trying to navigate the overwhelming chaos of a world that felt increasingly hostile. But Linda could see the fire in her eyes. Maya wasn't giving up. Not now. Linda sat down beside her, the weight of the files still fresh in her mind. Maya, I need you to stay strong. Things are going to get tougher before they get better, but we're going to make it through this, together. Maya looked up at her mother, the same fire in her eyes. I'm not scared, Mom. We'll fight. We won't let them win. Linda smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair away from Maya's face. Her daughter's resolve, her unwavering belief in justice, was what kept her going. But even with the evidence in hand, Linda knew they were just beginning the hardest part of the battle. The corruption ran deep, the enemies they were facing were powerful. But Linda wouldn't stop. Not now, not when the truth was within reach. Linda's phone rang late that night, its shrill tone cutting through the silence that had settled over the house. She jolted upright, her heart immediately racing. There was no time for hesitation. Maya, Linda whispered to herself as she grabbed the phone, her fingers trembling as she answered. But it wasn't Maya on the other end. Is this Linda Bennett? The voice was distorted, garbled, like it was being filtered through layers of interference. It didn't sound familiar, but Linda immediately felt a chill in her spine. This is she, Linda replied, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. We have your daughter, the voice continued, unfazed by the tremor that had crept into Linda's own voice. You wanted the truth, didn't you? Now you'll see just how deep it goes. Linda's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. But the words barely had time to sink in before the voice continued, sending a wave of dread through her entire body. We've got her. If you want to see her again, you'll stay quiet. Don't tell the authorities. Don't go public. You won't get her back otherwise. The line went dead. Linda stood frozen, the phone slipping from her hand and hitting the floor with a dull thud. Her head spun, the panic threatening to take over, but she shoved it down, burying the rising fear beneath a blanket of resolve. She had no choice but to act. They had her daughter, and they would stop at nothing to silence them both. But Linda knew she couldn't show fear. Not now. Maya. Linda's feet moved before she could fully process what had happened. She rushed to the front door, already dialing Sarah's number. "Sarah, they've taken her. Maya's gone. We have to find her. We need to move now." There was a moment of hesitation on the other end. Linda knew Sarah understood the gravity of the situation. They both knew that the forces they were up against were far from ordinary. They were dangerous, but that didn't matter. Maya was everything to her. "Meet me at the old warehouse, the one on 7th and 10th. Sarah's voice cut through the static. "We can't trust anyone. I'll make sure we have people looking for her." Linda grabbed her coat, her mind focused only on one thing, getting Maya back. As she drove to the meeting point, her hands gripped the steering wheel so tight her knuckles turned white. Every passing minute felt like an eternity. Linda couldn't shake the image of Maya's face when they had last spoken, her daughter's trusting eyes that had looked up to her for strength. And now, those eyes were likely filled with fear, alone in the hands of people who wanted to destroy everything they had fought for. When she arrived at the warehouse, Sarah was already there, her car parked in the shadows of the dilapidated building. Linda pulled in beside her, not wasting a second before slamming the door open and stepping out. "You have any leads?" Linda asked as she met Sarah near the entrance. "I've got some," Sarah said, her voice grim. "We've been tracing some of the calls, trying to get a location, but nothing solid yet. We're looking at a few different possibilities." Linda's eyes narrowed. "Who's behind this? Who would go this far?" Sarah paused, her gaze locking onto Linda's. "I think it's them, Green's people. It's the only explanation that makes sense. We got too close to the truth." Linda's heart sank. She had suspected this would come, but hearing Sarah confirm it made the weight of their situation more real than ever. It wasn't just Green anymore. The entire system they were fighting against had now taken an active role in silencing them. Just then, Sarah's phone buzzed, breaking the tension. She glanced at the screen, her expression hardening. "We've got a location," she said, her voice sharp. "It's a few miles from here." "Let's go," Linda said, already moving toward her car. They drove in silence, the urgency of the situation suffocating the air between them. Linda's thoughts were racing as she wondered if they were even going to be in time, or if the people who had taken Maya were already making their next move. The thought gnawed at her, but she pushed it aside. She wouldn't stop. She couldn't. When they arrived, the small warehouse in front of them looked abandoned, but Linda knew better than to assume safety. There were no signs of life, no movement inside. Yet the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she glanced around, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "Stay sharp," Sarah whispered, as both women carefully approached the entrance. Linda could feel the pulse in her throat, the anticipation so thick it was almost suffocating. They entered the warehouse, the wooden floorboards creaking under their weight. The place was nearly empty, except for a few scattered crates and piles of forgotten debris. They moved cautiously through the shadows, their senses on high alert. "Where is she?" Linda whispered, her breath shallow with worry. She scanned every corner, every darkened space. Then she heard a sound, a soft whimper, the unmistakable sound of Maya's voice, weak but unmistakable. "Maya!" Linda shouted, running toward the sound. "Mama!" Maya's voice called out weakly from a corner of the room, her voice strained but filled with relief. Linda rushed to her, finding Maya bound to a chair, her face pale but her eyes wide with relief at the sight of her mother. The bonds around her wrists were tight, but Linda could see the faint traces of bruising on her daughter's arms, evidence of the fear she had endured. "Maya, baby, are you okay?" Linda knelt beside her, her hands working to untie the ropes. Maya nodded shakily, her voice hoarse. "I'm scared, Mom. They said you'd never come. I'm here, baby. I'm here now," Linda whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead as she finished untying her. But even as they embraced, Linda knew that the battle was far from over. The fight for justice had only just begun, and the forces they were up against would stop at nothing to win. And now, Linda would do whatever it took to make sure Maya never had to face that fear again. The moment Maya's hands were free, Linda didn't hesitate. She scooped her daughter up in her arms, ignoring the burn in her muscles, as she quickly helped Maya to her feet. The warehouse was eerily silent, the only sound the ragged breaths they took as they moved further into the shadows. "We need to move fast," Linda whispered urgently, her voice low but firm. "They won't leave us alone for long. We have to get out of here." Maya, still shaken but visibly relieved to be free from her restraints, nodded. Her legs wobbled, but Linda supported her as they moved through the darkened room. The fear that had gripped Linda earlier was now replaced with an overwhelming surge of adrenaline. Every part of her body was on alert, the air heavy with the knowledge that their every move could be their last. A sudden noise echoed from the back of the warehouse. Footsteps, then another. "They're coming," Linda whispered, her heart racing in her chest. She had no idea how many people were in the building, but she knew they were running out of time. They had to escape, and they had to do it now. Maya's grip on Linda's arm tightened. "Mom, what do we do?" she asked, her voice shaking. Linda didn't answer immediately. She had no plan. There was no time for one, just instinct. She pulled Maya behind a stack of crates, her mind working at lightning speed. "We wait. We need to get out of here quietly. We'll use the back door." The footsteps grew louder, closer now. Linda's pulse quickened. She could hear muffled voices, low and threatening. They were coming closer. They couldn't afford to make a sound. "Maya, listen to me," Linda said urgently, crouching beside her daughter. "Stay quiet, stay close." Maya nodded, her face pale, but she trusted her mother. The door creaked open. Just a little at first, then wider. Linda's heart stopped as a shadow passed by the small crack between the door and the wall. She held her breath, her body tense, her mind racing. The figure in the hallway paused, and for a moment Linda thought they'd been caught. But then, the figure moved on. A small sound of relief escaped her lips, but she didn't waste any time. They had to act now. "Now! Maya!" Linda whispered, her voice fierce. They moved quickly, almost silently, slipping through the small gap in the back door, into the alley behind the warehouse. The night air hit them like a cold slap, but Linda barely felt it. She had one mission in mind: keep Maya safe. They ran, not fast but quick enough to get some distance between them and the warehouse. Linda's eyes darted around, scanning for any sign of pursuit. Every step she took felt like it might be their last, but they couldn't stop. Not now. "Maya, keep up," Linda urged as she pulled her daughter along. But Maya's legs were weak, her body still recovering from the shock and fear. Linda could feel the weight of her in her arms, and her heart ached. She couldn't carry her for long, but she had no choice. They rounded the corner of the building, and Linda's mind raced. Where could they go? Who could they trust? Sarah had warned them to be careful. There was nowhere safe. The people behind this were everywhere. Linda's breath came in short, ragged gasps. She had to keep thinking. They couldn't outrun their enemies forever. A loud shout pierced the night air, the first sign that they had been noticed. "Maya, run!" Linda shouted, pushing her daughter forward as she grabbed her own phone from her pocket. There was only one person Linda could trust right now: Sarah. She dialed her number without a second thought. The phone rang, each ring echoing in Linda's mind as she watched the alley behind them, waiting for the next move. "Sarah, we're being followed," Linda hissed into the phone. "We need a safe house, now." There was a moment of silence. Then Sarah's voice came through, calm but with an edge of urgency. "I know a place. I'll be there in 5. Get to the end of the alley and head for the underpass. Don't stop. I'll meet you there." Linda didn't hesitate. She grabbed Maya's hand, pulling her along, not looking back. The urgency in Sarah's voice told Linda everything she needed to know. This wasn't just a simple escape. This was a race to stay one step ahead of the forces trying to tear their lives apart. They reached the end of the alley, and Linda's heart skipped when she saw the underpass up ahead. The shadows there seemed darker than ever, but it was their only chance. "Maya, I need you to stay strong," Linda said, her voice low, but filled with a determination she hoped her daughter could feel. "We're almost there." Maya, breathless and scared, nodded, but Linda saw the hesitation in her eyes. Her daughter was strong, but she was still just a child. She shouldn't have to face this. They reached the underpass and stopped briefly, Linda scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The night was still, too still. She reached for her phone again, her fingers trembling as she dialed Sarah's number once more. No answer. Linda's heart raced. Where was Sarah? Why hadn't she answered? "Maya, stay here," Linda whispered urgently, pushing her daughter into the corner of the underpass as she crouched low, trying to keep them hidden. She had to find out what was going on. Just then, a car's headlights flashed from the end of the underpass. The silhouette of a vehicle appeared, its engine roaring to life. Sarah! Linda's heart leapt. She waved Maya forward, but the sound of approaching footsteps froze them both. "Get in!" Sarah yelled as she slammed the brakes, the car sliding to a stop just in front of them. Linda didn't wait. She grabbed Maya's hand, pulling her into the car. The door slammed shut behind them, and Sarah's car screeched off into the night, the lights blurring in the rearview mirror as they sped away. Maya, exhausted and overwhelmed, leaned her head against Linda's shoulder. She was safe. for now. But Linda knew the fight was far from over. The people who had taken Maya would stop at nothing to silence them. And now, more than ever, Linda was determined to make sure that wouldn't happen. The air inside the United Nations building was thick with anticipation. Linda stood beside Maya, both of them just a few feet away from the podium where the world would soon listen. Maya's heart pounded in her chest, but there was a fire in her eyes that Linda had never seen before, stronger, more intense than any fear she had felt. "This is it," Linda whispered, her voice soft but firm. Maya nodded, her hand clutching the edges of her jacket. She had spoken in front of small groups before, but this was different. This wasn't just a speech. This was her moment to tell the world what she had seen, what she had learned, what was broken in the world that needed fixing. The moment that had been thrust upon her, an innocent protest, a corrupt system, a kidnapped child, had now led her to this podium. "I'm ready, Mom," Maya said, her voice steady, yet there was a trace of uncertainty. "You've always been ready," Linda replied, her eyes unwavering. "Just speak from your heart. The world needs to hear your truth." As the room settled, the murmurs of the crowd began to fade. Maya stepped up to the microphone, her small hands gripping it as she stood in front of an audience made up of dignitaries, world leaders, and activists. There were thousands of eyes on her. Maya took a deep breath, glancing at her mother before looking out over the crowd. She could feel the weight of their gazes, but she stood tall. She had come this far. She would not falter now. The silence in the room grew heavier as Maya finally spoke, her voice resonating with an unexpected confidence. "My name is Maya Bennett," she began, her words slow but powerful, "and I am here to tell you that my voice matters. My voice is not the voice of a child who should be silenced. It is the voice of every child who has ever been ignored, every person who has been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin, their gender, their background." Her words reverberated through the hall. Linda's heart swelled with pride, but she knew this was only the beginning. Maya's voice would be heard by millions, but what would happen after? What change would they truly see? "The system that is meant to protect us is broken," Maya continued, her voice unwavering. "I'm here today because I believe in justice. I believe in a world where we don't have to live in fear, where people aren't judged for who they are. But I also believe in hope. I believe in the power of standing together, in fighting for what is right, even when it feels like we're not strong enough." Linda's eyes welled up as she watched Maya speak. She could feel the weight of everything Maya had been through, the kidnapping, the threats, the hate. But Maya was standing here, standing strong and speaking truth to power. The child who had been threatened by those in power was now the one taking the power back. "We cannot remain silent," Maya continued, her voice growing in strength. "If we do, then we are complicit. We cannot allow people to live in fear, to be silenced by corrupt systems that benefit from their pain. We need to stand together, no matter how big the challenge. We need to fight for justice, not just for ourselves, but for the generations to come." A hushed silence fell over the room as Maya paused, her eyes sweeping across the sea of faces. She was speaking not only to those in the room, but to everyone watching. She was speaking to the world. Maya took a moment to steady herself before continuing. "I know that I'm just a kid. I know that my voice doesn't have the weight of some others, but it has to be heard, because if we don't fight for justice now, when will we?" Linda's breath caught in her throat as Maya's words rang out in the room. She had heard her daughter speak with passion before, but this was something else. This was a call to action. Justice is not just a word we say, it's a choice we make every day. And I'm here to tell you that we cannot keep letting the powerful control the lives of the weak. We cannot keep letting children like me be afraid of the very people who are supposed to protect us. We need to do better. Maya's eyes sparkled with unshed tears, but her face was set with determination. She had found her voice, and now she was not going to let it be silenced. "This is our moment," Maya said, her voice strong. "This is our moment to make things right, to change the world." The room was silent for a long moment before a few quiet claps started. Slowly, the applause grew louder, spreading throughout the hall. The leaders, the delegates, and the activists all rose to their feet. Linda stood beside her daughter, watching as Maya was enveloped in applause. She had done it. She had said what needed to be said, and the world had heard her. As they left the stage, Linda placed her hand on Maya's shoulder, her heart overflowing with pride. "You did it, Maya," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I did it," Maya whispered back, a smile breaking through her nervousness. We did it. But even as the applause echoed in the halls, Linda knew this was only the beginning. Maya's fight for justice was far from over. There would be more battles, more threats, more struggles, but they had won something today. They had shown the world that even the smallest voice could break through the silence. And for Linda, that was the most powerful thing she had ever witnessed. The aftermath of Maya's speech at the United Nations had shaken the world, but it had also ignited a firestorm. Her words had resonated deeply, sparking protests, debates, and, for the first time in a long time, a serious conversation about the systemic issues plaguing the justice system. But as with all fights for justice, it came at a cost. Linda paced in the small office, her mind racing as she glanced at the multiple news stories and social media posts flooding her screens. While many celebrated Maya's bravery, there were others, powerful, dangerous others, who were looking for ways to crush their momentum. The media had turned into a battlefield, and now it wasn't just about making the truth known. It was about surviving long enough to see the change they were fighting for. "Mom, we need to talk," Maya's voice cut through Linda's thoughts, and she turned to find her daughter standing at the doorway, eyes wide with concern. Linda's chest tightened. She knew what Maya was going to say. The world was shifting, but in ways they hadn't expected. Maya had stepped into the spotlight, but now the spotlight was shining back on them, casting shadows of its own. "What's going on?" Linda asked, motioning for her daughter to come in. Maya stepped inside, her face a mixture of determination and fear. "I've been seeing the news," she said, her voice shaking. "They're calling me a radical. They're saying you and I are dangerous. They want to tear everything down, say we're disrupting the peace." Linda's heart sank. She had expected the backlash, but hearing it in Maya's voice made it all the more real. "They don't want to hear the truth, Maya. They never do when it's inconvenient." Maya sat down beside her, her hands fidgeting nervously. "I don't know if I can keep doing this, Mom. It feels like every time we take one step forward, they push us 2 steps back." Linda placed her hand on her daughter's shoulder. "It's not going to be easy. We knew this wasn't going to be a one-time battle. This is a war against everything that's been allowed to go on for so long. But we have to keep pushing, Maya. We don't have a choice." The words felt hollow in the air as Linda spoke them. She knew she had to believe them, but the pressure mounting against them was overwhelming. The political war they had unknowingly stepped into was escalating, and quickly. The people behind the systems they were trying to change were relentless. As Linda sat down at her desk, her mind flicked back to the names Sarah had shared. Those people in power, the ones who controlled everything behind the scenes. They had always operated from the shadows, too comfortable to care about the voices of those they had oppressed. Now, those shadows were coming to the light, and they were fighting back. A knock at the door startled her. Sarah stepped in, her face grave. "We need to talk. It's getting worse. They're organizing, Linda. We've got more enemies than we thought." Linda's stomach tightened. "Who?" "Collins, the councilman, and his people. They've started pushing harder, using the media, stirring up fear, spreading lies. They're calling for you to be disbarred, accusing you of inciting violence." Linda's jaw clenched. Roger Collins. She had known his name for years, but now she knew it was no longer just about politics. He was involved in something much deeper, something corrupt beyond comprehension. The pieces were falling into place, and they didn't like the way the game was shifting. "They're trying to shut us down," Sarah continued, her voice low. "And they're using everything they have to do it. Public pressure, political connections, and now even the legal system. They've got influence in the right places. It's not just about public opinion anymore. They've weaponized the media against us." Linda stood up, her hands trembling, but her resolve hardening. "We can't back down. Not now. Not after everything Maya has said. Not after everything we've done." "We need to hit them harder," Sarah said, looking at Linda with a sharpness in her eyes. "We need to turn their game back on them. Expose the corruption in the system. Get ahead of the story before they twist it further." Maya looked between the two women, her expression both worried and determined. "How do we do that?" "We go public with the information we've got. We get the truth out there right now. We can't let them control the narrative," Linda said, her voice firm as she locked eyes with Maya. "We have to make them fear us." Maya nodded, the weight of what she was about to do settling over her like a heavy cloak. But she wasn't scared, not anymore. She had found her voice, and now it was time to use it. The next few days were a blur. Linda and Sarah worked tirelessly to coordinate their efforts, gathering the evidence they had on Collins, on Green, and on the network that had kept the corruption in place for so long. They knew that their window of opportunity was small. Every day that passed brought more danger, more pressure. But they had a plan now. The night before they were set to go public, Linda sat in the quiet of her office, staring at the screen of her laptop. She had drafted the statement, but there was something else on her mind. She knew the fight ahead was only going to get more brutal. The world would try to tear them down, twist their words, accuse them of things they didn't do. But Linda's resolve was unshakable. This was their fight now. "Maya," Linda whispered, turning to her daughter who had just entered the room. "You've already made a difference, but this isn't over, not by a long shot." Maya smiled at her mother, a small, determined smile. "I know, but we're not stopping, not until it's done." Linda nodded. "No, we're not." They were on the front lines now, in the middle of a war that had started long before they even knew it. The political forces they were facing would stop at nothing to keep their power. But Linda and Maya had already proven one thing. Their voices could not be silenced. Not now, not ever. Linda sat across from Officer Carver, her fingers nervously tapping on the wooden table. The dim light of the interrogation room hung heavy in the air. The room was silent save for the occasional hum of the air conditioning. This was the moment they had been waiting for. But even now, as Carver sat in front of her, fidgeting, avoiding eye contact, Linda couldn't shake the feeling that this moment might slip through their fingers. Carver had been quiet for days now, after the confrontation in the warehouse, after everything that had happened. She'd agreed to meet Linda in private, agreeing to give her answers, but there was hesitation in her eyes, something that told Linda this was far from straightforward. "You wanted to meet. You've got my attention," Linda said, her voice steady but filled with an edge. "But I need answers, and I need them now, Carver." Carver shifted in her seat, her eyes glancing down at her hands, twisting in her lap. She had been through so much, guilt, fear, and the looming knowledge that she was in too deep. Linda could see it in the way Carver was trying to hold herself together, trying to control her emotions, but failing. "I don't know where to start," Carver murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Linda leaned forward, locking eyes with her. "You start by telling me the truth, everything." Carver swallowed hard, her eyes flickering toward the door as if looking for an escape. But she knew there was no escape now. They had her. She couldn't run anymore. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of silence, Carver spoke. "I never meant for it to get this far. I thought I could do my job, follow the rules, but they had me. They had me right from the beginning." Linda's pulse quickened. She leaned in closer, the tension in the room palpable. "Who had you?" Carver closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. "Roger Collins. I didn't want to believe it at first. I knew he was dirty, but I thought I could just turn a blind eye. But when things started to get worse, when I started hearing about the money, the deals, the lies, I couldn't look away anymore. He had control over everything, over Green, over the whole department." Linda's mind raced. Collins. The same name they had been chasing, the same name that kept appearing in the documents Sarah had uncovered. The pieces were falling into place. "And you?" Linda asked, her voice sharper now. "What role did you play in all this?" I tried to stay out of it, but every time I turned my back, they pulled me back in," Carver continued, her voice trembling. "Green was the enforcer. He was the one who made sure everyone stayed quiet. He knew what I was afraid of. He used it against me." Linda leaned back in her chair, processing the information. She had suspected as much. Carver wasn't entirely innocent, but this was more than just complicity. She was entangled in something much darker, something that had ensnared her completely. "Why come to me now?" Linda asked, her voice quiet but steady. "After everything you've done, why tell me the truth?" Carver looked up at Linda, her eyes filled with pain. "Because I can't do it anymore. I can't live with the lies. I never thought it would get to this point. I thought I could just stay under the radar, stay safe. But now I see what's happening to people like Maya. I see the lies they're spreading about her, about you, and I can't be a part of that anymore." The confession was out. Carver had broken. But Linda knew this was just the beginning. The truth was now in the open, but the battle was far from over. Linda exhaled, a heavy weight settling in her chest. "You realize what this means, right? This isn't just about you and Green. It's bigger. It's about a whole system that's been corrupted. This is bigger than any one person. And if you're going to help us, you need to give us everything." Carver nodded, tears now freely running down her face. I know. I'm ready to help. I'll testify. I'll give you everything I know, everything that's been hidden. I need to make this right." Linda stood up, feeling the weight of what had just happened. She had what she needed: Carver's confession, the evidence that would expose the network of corruption at the heart of the police force. But she also knew the real fight was only just beginning. "I'm going to hold you to your word," Linda said, her voice cold but determined. "You're not getting out of this without consequences. But if you're serious, we'll take this all the way. This ends now." Carver nodded, her face etched with regret and relief. "I won't back down. I want to do what's right." As Linda walked out of the interrogation room, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. It was Sarah. "Linda, it's time. We've got the momentum now. We go public." The words hit her like a rush of wind. They were ready. The battle they had fought for so long was about to reach its peak, but Linda knew it wouldn't be easy. There were still powerful people out there, people who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. The confession was just the beginning of a much larger war, a war they couldn't afford to lose. The world was watching, and Linda knew it. She sat at the edge of her desk, her fingers gripping the edge, the weight of everything they had fought for pressing down on her. She had known that the confession from Officer Carver would be a turning point, but the next step in this battle was more fragile than anything they had done before. The apology that was about to happen could either cement their victory or tear everything they had built apart. Across from her, Maya sat quietly, watching her mother, sensing the tension in the air. There had been no time to process what had just transpired. The forces they had been up against were not backing down, and the people who had tried to silence them were not going to let a simple confession stop them. They had to hit harder now. But how? The phone buzzed on the desk, snapping Linda out of her thoughts. She reached for it, checking the incoming message. It was from Sarah. "The apology is scheduled. Tomorrow, live on national television. Collins is pushing for it. They'll do everything to make it seem like a genuine act of contrition, but it's a calculated move to stop us. We have to be ready." Linda's heart skipped a beat. The apology was a part of their strategy to mitigate the fallout. A public show of remorse was what Green and his colleagues needed to quell the outrage. They needed to make it seem like they were changing, that they were listening. But Linda knew better. This wasn't about redemption. It was about control, and she wasn't going to let them use this moment to manipulate the narrative. "We've got to be careful with what comes next," Linda said, turning to Maya, her voice calm but urgent. "This apology, it's a trap. We can't let them get away with it. We need to expose them for who they really are, not let them make this look like a moment of peace." Maya's eyes met her mother's, her young face hardening with determination. "I know, Mom, but how do we stop it? How do we make sure people see the truth?" Linda took a deep breath. She had been in the game long enough to understand how the rules worked, how they manipulated the system. She had to find a way to get ahead of this, to take control of the narrative before they did. "We go public," Linda said, her voice steady. "We'll release the full recording of Carver's confession. We'll let the world see exactly what's been going on, how deep the corruption runs, and how these people tried to use your voice to protect themselves. If they want to apologize, fine, but the truth won't be silenced." Maya nodded, but Linda could see the worry still in her daughter's eyes. This was dangerous territory. They weren't just exposing corruption anymore. They were exposing a system that could retaliate. They had no idea what kind of firestorm they were about to ignite, but one thing was certain: they were past the point of no return. The next day, the live broadcast began, and Linda sat in front of the television, her stomach twisted in knots. She watched as Officer Green stood behind a podium, flanked by colleagues and surrounded by cameras. His face was stiff, his eyes avoiding the camera. He looked uncomfortable, as though he knew this moment wasn't genuine. This wasn't the first apology he had given, and it wouldn't be the last. "Ladies and gentlemen," Green began, his voice cold, rehearsed, "I stand here today with a heavy heart. I know my actions have hurt many, and for that I am truly sorry. I've come to realize that we as officers of the law are held to a higher standard. We are here to protect, not to harm. And for those I have wronged, I offer my deepest apologies." Linda's hands clenched into fists as she watched. Every word he spoke, every gesture he made felt like a lie. He wasn't sorry, he was scared, scared of what was coming, scared of the truth that would soon surface. "Officer Green's apology is an important step," Collins spoke next, his voice smooth, calculated. "It shows accountability. It shows that we are listening, that we are committed to rebuilding trust with the people we serve." Linda's eyes narrowed. The truth was hidden in the layers of their rhetoric. They were trying to paint this as a moment of reconciliation, a chance to move forward. But the world wasn't blind. This was the beginning of their downfall. Just as the broadcast continued, Linda's phone buzzed again, this time with a notification. She opened it quickly, her heart racing as she read the message. The confession is out. It's time. Release it. Mom, what's happening? Maya asked, noticing the sudden shift in her mother's expression. Linda didn't answer right away. She reached for her phone, her fingers moving quickly to send the files to every news outlet they had contacted. She had to make sure the confession was out before anyone could spin it into something it wasn't. With a final press of a button, Linda sent the recording to every major network, every journalist who had supported them. The confession from Carver, raw and unedited, was now in the world's hands. There was no taking it back now. Maya's eyes widened as she saw her mother's movements. You just released it? Like that? Linda nodded, her face grim. The truth has to come out, Maya. No more games, no more pretending. The broadcast shifted back to green, but Linda was already tuned out. She knew what was coming. The storm was about to hit, and it would hit hard. But this time, they weren't going to be the ones caught in the crossfire. Within minutes, the internet exploded. News outlets were reporting the confession, sharing clips of Carver's tearful admission, her voice trembling as she revealed the truth about Collins, Green, and the corrupt system that had allowed them to manipulate the law for so long. The apology now seemed like a cheap attempt to placate the masses, a mere formality in the face of undeniable evidence. Maya watched the reaction unfold, a sense of pride swelling in her chest as she saw the world begin to wake up to the truth. But even as the apologies came pouring in from Collins and the others, Maya knew this battle was far from over. Linda sat beside her, watching the chaos unfold on the screen. But instead of fear, there was a quiet satisfaction in her heart. This was the beginning of the end, and they were ready for whatever came next. The weeks following the public release of Carver's confession had been a whirlwind, but now, as Linda stood in the center of the community gathering, a profound sense of calm washed over her. The streets of their neighborhood, once filled with whispers of fear and anger, were now alive with voices calling for change, voices of people who had been silenced for too long. Maya stood beside her, her eyes filled with a mixture of pride and uncertainty. But one thing was clear. They had won this battle, and now they had the responsibility to help their community heal. The news coverage of the confession had sparked a fire. What had started as a simple acknowledgement of wrongs had turned into an uncontrollable movement. Protesters gathered in support, while a wave of solidarity spread across the city. The streets that had once echoed with hatred were now filled with chants of justice and equality. They were no longer victims of the system. They were the system's reckoning. As Linda surveyed the crowd, her heart swelled. The people who had once felt powerless, the ones who had been beaten down by a corrupt system, were standing tall now. They were no longer alone. This was their moment. Maya turned to her mother, her voice soft but resolute. Mom, I didn't know it could feel like this. Linda smiled, placing a reassuring hand on her daughter's shoulder. It's the beginning of a new chapter, Maya. This is just the start. We've ignited something, and now it's time to keep pushing forward. The fight is never over. The crowd's energy had shifted. Where there was once fear, there was now a glimmer of hope. The rally had started as a protest, but as more people showed up, it had morphed into something else, something powerful. It was a celebration of progress. It was a promise that they would not be silenced again. People are finally listening, Maya said, her voice catching with emotion. They're starting to understand. Linda nodded, her gaze turning toward the platform where a few local leaders were speaking. Each word that left their mouths now carried more weight than before. The local government had started to take action. Even Collins, who had once seemed untouchable, was beginning to crumble under the weight of the scandal. But as Linda knew all too well, the fight was far from over. The road to true justice was long, and it would take more than one confession to dismantle the systems that had perpetuated the cycle of oppression. But this was the turning point. They had proven that the truth had power, and with that truth came accountability. Sarah approached them, a broad grin on her face. Looks like your speech did more than just make waves, Maya. You've sparked a movement. Look around. This isn't just about you and your mom anymore. This is about all of us. We're taking back what's ours. Maya's eyes brightened, but Linda could see the weight in them. It was a lot for her daughter to shoulder, more than a child should have to face. But Maya had become something more than just an advocate. She had become a symbol of resilience, the face of a generation ready to fight back. "We're doing it, Mom," Maya said, her voice full of quiet determination. "We're really doing it." Linda took a deep breath, feeling the shift in the air. It was more than just a fight for justice. It was a movement that transcended race, gender, and age. It was a movement that brought together people from all walks of life, united in their demand for fairness. But even as she felt the surge of hope, Linda knew they couldn't stop now. They had to keep going, building on the momentum they had created. The community needed to heal, yes, but healing wasn't just about feeling better. It was about action. It was about changing the system that had caused the pain in the first place. "I think it's time we start planning the next steps," Linda said, her voice firm. "We can't just let this die down. We need to keep pushing for real change. Not just in this neighborhood, but in every neighborhood. This isn't over until we've won." Sarah nodded. "We've got your back. We'll keep this movement alive no matter what it takes." Maya smiled softly, her eyes glinting with a fierce determination. "We'll make sure everyone knows what happened. No one's getting away with this." Linda watched as her daughter's words echoed through the crowd, the power of her voice palpable. This wasn't just a moment, it was a movement, a revolution of the spirit, a revolution for justice, a revolution for equality. In the weeks that followed, the community worked tirelessly to rebuild what had been lost. Legal reforms were pushed forward. The police department was forced to implement new accountability measures. The fight for justice became a permanent fixture in the fabric of their lives. The collective strength of the community became its most powerful weapon. For Linda and Maya, it was a bittersweet victory. The scars of the past would never disappear, but the future was theirs to shape. Together, they had taken on the system and come out victorious. The fear and silence that had once ruled their lives had been replaced with hope and action. "We did it, Maya," Linda said one night as they sat on the porch, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. "But this is only the beginning," Maya nodded, her gaze steady. "We'll keep fighting for the ones who can't, for the ones who came before us, and for the ones who will come after." Linda wrapped her arm around her daughter, feeling the weight of the journey they had been through. But she also felt something else, a quiet certainty. They had changed the world, and they would keep changing it, one step at a time. The weight of everything they had fought for settled heavily on Linda's shoulders. The final battle was at hand, the last critical step in their long and dangerous journey. It was a fight for more than just their lives. It was a fight for justice, for truth, and for the future of their community. They had taken down one system, but another was ready to rise in its place, determined to restore the power it had so ruthlessly clung to. Linda knew the stakes were higher than ever, and they couldn't afford to fail now. The phone rang late that night. Linda didn't need to see the number to know who it was. She picked it up, already dreading what was coming. "Linda," Sarah's voice was tight with urgency. "It's happening. They're pulling all the strings now. They've already discredited us in the media, and Collins is making his final move." Linda's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. "What's the plan?" "They're going to hit us where it hurts, personally. We've got to be ready. We can't let them paint us as radicals again. We have to turn the tables, and we need to do it quickly." Linda nodded, even though Sarah couldn't see her. She had known that this fight wasn't going to end with Carver's confession. She had known that the powers they were up against would never simply walk away. And now the time had come to confront the full scope of their enemy. "Meet me tomorrow," Linda said, her tone resolute. "We end this, once and for all." The next day, the streets were lined with people. The protest that had started with just a handful of voices was now a movement that had grown to encompass an entire city. People who had once been afraid to speak up now stood with unwavering courage, rallying behind Maya and Linda. But there was a tension in the air. Linda could feel it, a sense that everything was on the precipice of either victory or collapse. The forces they were up against were not going to let go easily. Linda and Sarah arrived at the courthouse where the final battle would unfold. The media had been waiting for them, cameras flashing as they stepped out of the car. Linda could hear the murmurs of the crowd, the buzz of anticipation. It felt like the entire city had turned out to see what would happen next. The doors to the courthouse opened and Linda stepped forward, Maya by her side. The young girl had grown up in front of the world, her face now a symbol of strength, resilience, and courage. But Linda could see the weight in her daughter's eyes. This fight had cost them both more than they could ever fully comprehend. "Mom, do you think this will be over soon?" Maya asked, her voice low as they walked toward the steps. Linda looked down at her daughter, her heart aching with the knowledge of what they had been through and what they still had yet to face. "No, sweetie, I don't think it will be over soon. But this is the fight we've been waiting for. We've got the truth on our side, and we're not backing down." Inside the courthouse, the air was thick with tension. Collins was there, flanked by his most loyal supporters, his face hard with determination. Linda's eyes met his, and for the first time she felt a surge of real fear. He had never looked more dangerous, and she knew that he would stop at nothing to win. But this time, it was different. Linda was no longer fighting alone. This was not just her battle. It was their battle. And they had the power of truth, justice, and the entire community behind them. The trial began, and the arguments were heated. Collins stood at the front, speaking with all the power he could muster, but every word he spoke was laced with deception. Linda, standing at the other end, held her ground. She had prepared for this moment her entire life, and now it was here. "I stand before you today," Linda said, her voice calm but unwavering, "because the truth cannot remain hidden any longer. For too long, we have allowed corruption to fester in our city. For too long, we have allowed power to control our lives. But we will not be silenced any longer. We will not let those who have abused their power continue to destroy the lives of innocent people." Her words cut through the air like a blade. The room was silent, and Linda could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on Collins, pushing him back with each syllable. He couldn't hide anymore. The lies had been exposed, and now it was time for him to pay. Collins sneered, but Linda could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He knew it was over. The walls were closing in, and he had nowhere left to run. "We will fight back," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "We have the power. We have the money. You will not win." But Linda didn't flinch. She stood tall, her heart steady, knowing that this was the moment they had fought for. "Power built on lies is fragile," Linda said, her voice cutting through the tension. "And today, we're going to tear it down." The final arguments played out, and as the courtroom waited for the verdict, the air felt heavy with anticipation. Linda's heart beat in her chest, the weight of everything riding on the judge's decision. Would the truth finally prevail, or would the corrupt forces of the system once again win? When the judge finally spoke, the room fell into complete silence. "The case is clear. The defendants are guilty of corruption, abuse of power, and manipulation. They will face the consequences of their actions." The words hit Linda like a shockwave. The room erupted in applause, but Linda remained still, her heart racing. They had done it. The battle was won. As Linda stood up, Maya by her side, she felt a rush of emotions, relief, triumph, and even a sense of disbelief. They had won. The forces of corruption had been exposed, and the truth had come through. But as Linda looked at her daughter, she knew that this was just the beginning. The fight for justice was never over. They had taken a stand, and now they would continue to fight for their community, for their future, and for the truth that could never be silenced again.